There's a crisis unfolding right now in financial markets, and most people don't even know it happened. Not tomorrow, not next year. It already happened. Between 2010 and 2012, the entire European monetary system came within hours of complete collapse. We're talking about 340 million people waking up one morning to find their money worthless. Pension funds evaporated, bank accounts frozen. The second largest reserve currency in the world reduced to digital scrap paper. And it almost happened. This isn't speculation. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented fact. The euro, that symbol of European unity and economic power, nearly died. And the only reason you're not studying its collapse in history books right now is because of a series of emergency interventions that most people still don't understand. Here's what they don't tell you about financial crises. They don't announce themselves with sirens and warnings. They creep up in bond markets and interest rate spreads. They hide in the footnotes of central bank reports. And by the time regular people notice, it's already too late. In late 2009, a new government in Greece made a confession. Their budget deficit wasn't 3% of GDP like they'd been reporting. It was actually 15.6%. They'd been cooking the books for years. And suddenly, everyone realized they had no idea what was really happening in Europe's economy. Markets don't like uncertainty. They absolutely hate dishonesty. Greek bond yields the interest rate investors demand to lend money to the government started climbing 5%, 6%, 7%. When a country's borrowing costs hit 7%, that's the kiss of death. You can't run a modern economy when you're paying 7% interest on your debt. It's unsustainable. It's a mathematical certainty of default. And Greece wasn't just approaching that threshold. They were racing toward it like a freight train with no brakes. But here's where it gets interesting. Greece was just the canary in the coal mine. Portugal was next. Then Ireland. Then Spain. Then Italy. These weren't isolated incidents. This was systemic failure spreading through the Eurozone like a virus. The problem was structural, and most economists saw it coming from the beginning. When you create a monetary union, you tie together countries with vastly different economies, different productivity levels, different fiscal policies. You give them all the same currency, the same interest rates, the same monetary policy. Germany, with its export powerhouse and fiscal discipline, was playing by different rules than Greece, with its early retirement ages and generous public sector. But they shared the same currency. They were locked into the same system. And when crisis hit, they had no escape valve. Think about it this way. If California has an economic crisis, workers can move to Texas. The federal government can transfer resources. The currency can adjust. But in Europe, you had sovereign nations bound together by a currency they couldn't control and couldn't exit without catastrophic consequences. German taxpayers didn't want to bail out what they saw as Greek financial irresponsibility. Greek citizens didn't want foreign powers dictating their economic policy, and yet they were trapped together in a monetary union that was tearing itself apart. In May 2010, Greece got its first bailout, 110 billion euros from the European Union and International Monetary Fund, the largest bailout in history at that time, and it came with conditions, brutal conditions: cut pensions, raise taxes, fire public workers, slash the minimum wage. Greece had to implement 12 rounds of austerity measures between 2010 and 2016. The Greek people took to the streets. Riots erupted. The country was coming apart. And here's the thing that makes this so much worse. The bailout wasn't really about saving Greece. According to a leaked IMF document from May 2010, the Greek bailout was designed to rescue French and German banks who had lent money to Greece. The Greek people got austerity. European banks got their money back. IMF board members from India, Brazil, Argentina, Russia, and Switzerland criticized this approach in an internal memo. They pointed out that Greek debt would be unsustainable no matter what. But their French, German, and Dutch colleagues refused to make private banks take losses. So the Greek people paid instead. The medicine was supposed to fix the patient. Instead, it made everything worse. Greek GDP collapsed by 25% from 2010 to 2014. Unemployment hit 27%. For young people, it was over 50%. Imagine half the young people in your country unable to find work. Imagine your economy shrinking by a quarter in 4 years. That's not a recession. That's economic devastation. That's the kind of collapse that topples governments and breeds extremism. And Greece wasn't alone. Ireland's banking system had imploded after guaranteeing the debts of 6 major banks when the housing bubble burst. Portugal had been running up debt for decades, taking advantage of low interest rates after joining the euro. Spain faced a massive banking crisis as its property market collapsed. By 2011 and 2012, the crisis was spreading. Italian bond yields were climbing towards 7%. If Italy fell, the entire system would collapse. Italy's economy was too big to bail out. There simply wasn't enough money in all of Europe to rescue Italy the way they'd rescued Greece. This is when you start to see the emergency measures, the desperate interventions, the things they said they'd never do. In December 2011, the European Central Bank, led by its new president, Mario Draghi, brokered a €489 billion loan program to European banks. Think about that number. €489 billion lent to banks at incredibly low interest rates. The hope was that banks would use this money to buy government bonds from struggling countries, bringing down their borrowing costs. It worked, temporarily. But by summer 2012, the crisis was back with a vengeance. Spanish bond yields topped 7%. Italian yields were climbing fast. Speculation about a Greek exit from the Eurozone, nicknamed Grexit, was dominating financial markets. Depositors in Greece were pulling their money out of banks at a terrifying rate. In May 2012 alone, Greek savers withdrew €700 million in a single day. They were preparing for the worst. If Greece left the euro and returned to the drachma, their savings would be worth a fraction of their current value overnight. Bank runs like this are how financial systems die. The European Central Bank had already launched something called the Securities Market Program back in May 2010. This allowed the ECB to buy government bonds on secondary markets. They'd purchased €212.1 billion worth of bonds by 2012, but it wasn't enough. The problem was credibility. Markets didn't believe European institutions had the will or the legal authority to do whatever was necessary. Germany's central bank, the Bundesbank, was openly opposing bond purchases. German leaders were constrained by domestic politics and constitutional courts. Every emergency measure was negotiated in marathon summit meetings. European leaders would gather in Brussels, argue through the night, announce a package they claimed would solve the crisis. Markets would rally for a few days or weeks. Then the crisis would come roaring back. The European Financial Stability Facility, created in May 2010, was supposed to be a €440 billion bailout fund, but it was structured in a way that limited its effectiveness. It required unanimous approval from Eurozone members for major decisions. Slovakia's government actually collapsed over a vote to expand the EU. In March 2011, European leaders agreed to create a permanent rescue mechanism called the European Stability Mechanism. It would have €500 billion in lending capacity, but it wouldn't be operational until September 2012. The question was whether the Eurozone would survive that long. Here's what most people don't understand about modern financial crises. They're about confidence as much as fundamentals. If investors believe a country can pay its debts, they'll lend at reasonable rates. If they lose confidence, interest rates spike and debt becomes unsustainable. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. By July 2012, confidence in the euro was evaporating. Investors were seriously pricing in the possibility of Eurozone breakup. Capital was fleeing southern Europe for Germany and other safe havens. The fragmentation of European financial markets was undoing decades of integration. Then came July 26, 2012, a conference in London. Mario Draghi, president of the European Central Bank, was speaking to an audience of investors. European bond markets were in chaos. The future of the euro hung in the balance, and Draghi said 3 words that changed everything. Within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough. Whatever it takes, 3 words, no specifics, no detailed plan, just a commitment. An open-ended promise that the European Central Bank would not let the euro fail. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Bond yields in Italy and Spain began falling. Market panic started to ease. Investors who had been betting against the euro suddenly faced an opponent with unlimited firepower. The ECB could print euros, it could buy unlimited quantities of government bonds if it chose to. On August 2nd, Draghi followed up with more details. The ECB would undertake outright open market operations of a size adequate to reach its objective. They were preparing to announce a new bond buying program. The financial world waited September 6, 2012. The ECB announced the Outright Monetary Transactions Program, OMT. This was the weapon Draghi had been preparing, and it was nuclear. The ECB would buy government bonds from struggling Eurozone countries, with no preset limits, potentially unlimited purchases. There were conditions. Countries had to apply for help from the European Stability Mechanism first. They had to agree to economic reforms and monitoring. But if they did, the ECB would step in with unlimited bond buying power to bring down their borrowing costs. This was unprecedented. The German Bundesbank president voted against it. He argued it violated the EU treaty's prohibition on monetary financing of governments. German politicians warned it would create moral hazard, encouraging countries to be fiscally irresponsible, knowing the ECB would bail them out. But Draghi pushed it through anyway. And here's the really remarkable thing. The OMT was never actually used. Not once. Not a single bond was purchased under the program. The announcement alone was enough. The mere existence of the weapon prevented anyone from testing it. From September 2012 onward, bond yields in struggling Eurozone countries fell steadily. The acute phase of the crisis was over. Not because economic fundamentals had changed, not because debt levels had declined, but because the European Central Bank had demonstrated it would defend the euro with overwhelming force. This is how modern central banking works. Sometimes the most powerful tool is the one you never have to use. The credible threat of action can be more effective than the action itself. Draghi had created a financial deterrent, but the cost of saving the euro was enormous. Greece had been forced into a 50% haircut on its debt in 2011, wiping out 100 billion euros owed to private creditors. The country received multiple bailouts totaling over 300 billion euros. And it still wasn't enough. Portuguese and Irish economies went through brutal recessions. Spain's unemployment rate reached over 25%. Youth unemployment across southern Europe created a lost generation. The social and political consequences are still playing out today. The crisis transformed European governance. The banking union framework was created, giving the ECB direct supervision over major banks. The ESM became a permanent institution with sophisticated crisis management tools. Fiscal rules were tightened, though compliance remains uneven. But the fundamental problems were never fully resolved. Southern European countries still have different economic structures and competitiveness levels than Germany and the Netherlands. There's still no fiscal union to complement the monetary union. The Eurozone architecture remains incomplete. Some economists argue that austerity made the crisis worse. By forcing deep spending cuts during recessions, European institutions turned a banking crisis into a depression in some countries. The alternative view is that without austerity, debt would have spiraled completely out of control. What we do know is that the decisions made between 2010 and 2012 will shape Europe for decades. The precedents set, the institutions created, the promises made. They've fundamentally altered the relationship between European nations and their shared currency. And here's what keeps economists awake at night. The underlying structural issues that caused the crisis haven't disappeared. Debt levels in Italy, France, and Greece remain elevated. Productivity growth is weak across much of Europe. The next crisis, when it comes, will test whether the fixes implemented were sufficient. The real story of the euro crisis isn't just about bad loans and budget deficits. It's about power, about who controls the future of hundreds of millions of people, about decisions made in rooms most citizens will never enter by people they never elected. When the crisis hit, the response was coordinated by what became known as the Troika: the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Three institutions with enormous power and very little democratic accountability. They negotiated the bailout terms, they monitored compliance, they effectively ran the economies of struggling nations. Think about what that meant in practice. Greece had to submit its budget to foreign review before its own parliament saw it. Ireland had to privatize state assets at fire sale prices. Portugal had to cut pensions for retirees who had worked their entire lives. And if they refused, the money stopped flowing and their economies would collapse. This wasn't the European Union that people thought they'd joined. This was something closer to economic occupation. The rhetoric was about solidarity and shared sacrifice. But the reality was, Northern European creditors dictating terms to Southern European debtors. The political consequences were predictable. In Greece, the traditional parties that had governed for decades were swept aside. Anti-austerity parties surged. In 2015, Syriza, a coalition of the radical left, won power promising to end austerity. Their finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, tried to negotiate better terms. He failed, spectacularly. In summer 2015, the Greek government called a referendum on accepting the Troika's latest bailout terms. 61% of Greeks voted no. The government accepted the terms anyway. What choice did they have? Without ECB support, Greek banks would collapse within days. This is the dirty secret of monetary union. Once you're in, you can't leave without catastrophic consequences. Your banking system runs on euros. Your debts are denominated in euros. Leaving means bank runs, currency collapse, and economic chaos that makes the Great Depression look mild. So countries that might have defaulted and devalued their currency, options that have worked for nations throughout history, were trapped. They had to take the medicine no matter how bitter, and the medicine was very bitter indeed. Let's talk about what austerity actually meant on the ground. In Greece, pensions were cut by up to 40%. Healthcare spending was slashed, leading to shortages of basic medicines. Public sector wages were frozen or reduced. The minimum wage dropped by 22%. People who had worked their entire lives suddenly found themselves unable to afford food and heating. Homelessness increased. Suicide rates rose. The social fabric of the country was being torn apart, and this wasn't some temporary emergency measure. This went on for years. The justification was always the same. These sacrifices are necessary to restore competitiveness, to balance budgets, to regain market confidence. The pain today will lead to prosperity tomorrow. But for many Greeks, tomorrow never came. Meanwhile, the banks that had made irresponsible loans got rescued. European financial institutions that had bought Greek bonds, knowing they were risky, got bailed out. Some took losses in the debt restructuring, but far less than they would have in a true default. And the cost was socialized across European taxpayers. This created a moral hazard problem that economists warned about from the start. If you always bail out creditors, they have no incentive to be careful about lending. If you always rescue banks, they have no reason to maintain adequate capital buffers. The system rewards risk-taking and punishes prudence. Ireland's story illustrates this perfectly. The Irish government had actually been running budget surpluses before the crisis. They were the good students of European fiscal policy. But they guaranteed the debts of 6 major Irish banks when the financial crisis hit. Those banks had financed a massive property bubble with borrowed money. When the bubble burst, the losses were staggering. By guaranteeing bank debts, the Irish government transformed private banking losses into public debt. Irish taxpayers ended up paying for the mistakes of bankers and the investors who funded them. The European Central Bank insisted that no bank bondholders should face losses. They threatened to cut off emergency lending to Irish banks if the government imposed losses on senior bondholders. This decision cost Ireland an estimated €8 billion. €8 billion that Irish taxpayers had to repay. Why did the ECB take this stance? Because many of those bondholders were French and German banks. Letting them take losses might have triggered a banking crisis in core Europe. So Ireland was sacrificed to protect the European financial system. This pattern repeated across the crisis countries. Portugal's bailout included privatization requirements that sold profitable state assets to foreign buyers at bargain prices. Spain had to accept a banking sector bailout that came with conditions on its broader economic policy. Cyprus had to accept losses on large bank deposits, effectively confiscating wealth from savers. Each bailout came with a memorandum of understanding, a detailed document specifying exactly what economic reforms the country had to implement. Labor market reforms, pension reforms, tax increases, spending cuts, privatizations. These weren't suggestions, they were requirements, monitored every few months by Troika inspectors. The Troika would arrive, review government accounts, assess progress on reforms, and decide whether to release the next tranche of bailout money. National governments became administrators of externally imposed policies. Democracy became a formality. The real decisions were made in Brussels, Frankfurt, and Washington. Some economists defend this approach. They argue that countries that had been fiscally irresponsible needed external discipline, that without tough conditions, bailout money would be wasted, that structural reforms were necessary for long-term growth. There's some truth to this, but the execution was deeply flawed. Study after study has shown that the economic projections used to justify austerity programs were wildly optimistic. The IMF itself later admitted that it underestimated the damage austerity would cause. They thought cutting spending by $1 would reduce GDP by 50 cents. It actually reduced GDP by $1.50 or more. This multiplier error meant the medicine prescribed was far too strong. Countries cut spending to reduce debt ratios, but their economies collapsed so fast that debt ratios actually increased. Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio was 130% in 2009. After years of austerity, it hit 180% in 2014. The human cost of these mistakes was enormous. Entire generations saw their prospects destroyed. Talented young people left Southern Europe in droves, seeking opportunity elsewhere. The brain drain weakened the very economies that needed skilled workers to recover. Political extremism flourished in the vacuum left by failed mainstream parties. In Greece, Golden Dawn, a neo-Nazi party, won parliamentary seats. In Italy, the Five-Star Movement and League gained power on anti-EU platforms. Across Europe, populist parties surged by blaming the EU and immigrants for economic hardship. The Brexit vote in 2016 was partly a result of this crisis. British voters saw the chaos in the Eurozone and decided they wanted no part of deeper European integration. The migration crisis of 2015, driven partly by Syrian refugees, was made worse by European economies too weak to handle the influx. So, when we talk about the Euro crisis being resolved, we need to be very careful what we mean. The acute phase ended. Bond yields came down. Countries regained market access. But the deeper problems remain unresolved. Italy still has a debt-to-GDP ratio above 130%. Youth unemployment in Southern Europe, while improved from crisis peaks, remains elevated. Productivity growth across the Eurozone has been anemic for over a decade. Banking systems in several countries remain fragile, and the institutional fixes that were implemented have created new tensions. The banking union gives the ECB enormous power over national banking systems. The tighter fiscal rules constrain national governments even when they might need to run deficits. The ESM can impose harsh conditions on countries that need help. Some economists argue that the Eurozone needs a true fiscal union to survive long-term. A common budget that can transfer resources from strong regions to weak regions, the way the U.S. federal budget does. Shared debt issuance, so strong countries back weak countries' borrowing. A genuine lender of last resort. But political will for such integration is completely absent. German voters don't want to transfer wealth permanently to Southern Europe. Southern European voters don't want permanent oversight of their budgets by Brussels. National sovereignty remains a powerful force in European politics. So the Eurozone exists in a precarious middle state. To integrate it to function as purely national economies. Not integrated enough to withstand major shocks without crisis. Held together partly by the enormous cost of breaking up and partly by hope that somehow it will muddle through. The COVID-19 pandemic provided another test of this system. Countries wanted to borrow heavily to support their economies during lockdowns. The European Central Bank launched massive bond buying programs, eventually totaling nearly €3 trillion. Fiscal rules were suspended. The EU even issued common debt for recovery programs. These responses showed that lessons had been learned from the 2010 to 2012 crisis. The ECB was much faster to act. Fiscal policy was much more supportive. There was less emphasis on immediate austerity and more focus on supporting economies through the shock. But it also revealed that the Eurozone can only function in crisis mode by breaking its own rules. The fiscal rules designed to prevent future crises get suspended when crises actually hit. The ECB's mandate technically prohibits monetary financing of governments, but its bond-buying programs push that boundary. This creates a system that operates on exceptions and extraordinary measures rather than sound institutional design. And that's not sustainable forever. Eventually, markets or political movements will test whether the will to preserve the euro remains strong enough. The next crisis might come from different sources. Climate change could create massive costs for adaptation and transition. Aging populations across Europe will strain pension and healthcare systems. Geopolitical tensions could disrupt energy supplies or trade. Rising interest rates could make debt burdens unsustainable again. When that crisis hits, will the Eurozone hold together? Will there be political will for more bailouts and transfers? Will the ECB have room to cut rates or buy bonds if inflation concerns constrain them? Will countries accept more centralized control in exchange for stability? Nobody knows the answers. What we do know is that the euro crisis of 2010 to 2012 was a near-death experience that the system barely survived. The scars remain visible in economic data, political movements, and institutional structures. Some countries never fully recovered. Greece's economy in 2024 was still smaller than it was in 2007, before the financial crisis began. An entire generation has known nothing but economic hardship and instability. The psychological damage of that experience is immeasurable. The crisis also revealed the fundamental problem at the heart of the European project. Economic integration without political integration creates a system that's unstable in crisis. You can't have a common currency without a common government in the long run. But building a common government requires sacrificing national sovereignty in ways most European citizens are unwilling to accept. So Europe remains caught between incomplete integration and impossible separation. The euro exists because the cost of abandoning it would be catastrophic. But it doesn't thrive because the institutional architecture remains incomplete. The secret deals that saved the euro weren't secret in the conspiratorial sense. They were emergency negotiations, weekend summits, central bank interventions. They were decisions made under extreme pressure with limited options. They were compromises between countries with conflicting interests. But they were also exercises of power that bypassed democratic processes. They were wealth transfers that socialized losses and privatized gains. They were political choices dressed up as economic necessity, and they set precedents that will shape Europe's future for generations. The euro survived, but at what cost? Millions of Europeans saw their living standards decline. Democratic accountability was subordinated to technocratic management. The European project, once seen as guaranteeing peace and prosperity, became associated with austerity and hardship. Historians will debate for decades whether the measures taken were necessary or whether alternatives existed, whether the pain inflicted was worth the stability achieved, whether the euro's survival justified the suffering of those in crisis countries. What's clear is that the Eurozone that emerged from the crisis is different from what came before. More centralized in some ways, more fragmented in others, held together by institutions created in desperation, sustained by the memory of how close it came to collapse. And the threat of future crisis never truly disappears. It lurks in debt levels and competitiveness gaps, in political divisions and incomplete institutions, in the fundamental contradiction of a monetary union without fiscal union. The next time bond yields spike and bank runs threaten, will the response be as effective? Will the political will exist to preserve the euro at any cost? Will the tools created last time be sufficient for next time's challenges? These questions matter because the euro is the second most important currency in the world. Its stability or collapse affects global trade, investment, and financial markets. What happens in European bond markets ripples through the world economy. The euro crisis showed that modern financial systems are fragile, that confidence can evaporate overnight, that institutions designed for normal times fail in extreme conditions, that political unity can crack under economic pressure, that the costs of crisis fall heaviest on those least able to bear them. It also showed that with sufficient will and resources, even dire situations can be stabilized, that central banks have enormous power when they choose to use it, that the threat of catastrophe can overcome political divisions, that systems can survive near-death experiences. The question is whether they can thrive after survival, whether the Eurozone can move beyond crisis management to building a truly sustainable monetary union, whether the political consensus exists for the deeper integration that would require. So far, the answer seems to be no. Europe remains committed to the euro, but unwilling to take the steps necessary to make it fully functional. Muddling through has become the strategy, hoping that the next crisis won't be worse than the last, betting that the memory of how close they came to collapse will be enough to hold things together next time. Maybe it will be. Maybe the institutions created and the lessons learned will prove sufficient. Maybe the European Central Bank's willingness to do whatever it takes will deter future speculation. Maybe the political costs of euro breakup will keep everyone at the table. Or maybe not. Maybe the next crisis will be the one that finally breaks the system. Maybe the political will to preserve the euro will finally crack. Maybe the contradictions built into the system will finally prove insurmountable. The euro almost collapsed once. The fact that it survived doesn't guarantee it will survive next time. The secret deals that saved it last time might not work again, and millions of Europeans live with that uncertainty hanging over their economic futures every single day.